the summer sun blazed over the rocky island of Corsica on August 15, 1769. In a small house in the town of a woman named Letizia Bonaparte screamed in pain as she brought her second child into the world. She did not know that the tiny baby boy she held would one day shake the foundations of Europe and change the course of human history. The baby was named Napoleon. His parents chose an Italian name because Corsica had been ruled by the Italian city of Genoa for centuries. At home, they spoke Italian and kept their old traditions. But outside their door, French soldiers patrolled the streets and French officials made the laws. Young Napoleon grew up feeling this tension every day. He was neither fully Italian nor fully French. This made him different from other children, and he knew it. His father arranged for him to attend school in mainland France. From there, Napoleon traveled to a school called the College of Autun. He decided he would show these French boys that he was better than all of them. He studied harder than anyone else. He learned to speak French without an accent. But inside his heart, he kept his pride in being. They called him a foreigner and said he did not belong at a French military school. Napoleon learned to fight back with his fists and with his words. He was small for his age, but he was fierce. Soon, the other boys learned not to bother him. He earned a reputation as someone who would never give up, no matter how tough things got. He told the other students that Corsica had brave warriors, and that his people were not afraid of anyone. He was fascinated by the science of warfare and the mathematics needed to aim guns accurately. He had achieved something remarkable for a boy from a conquered island. Through hard work, intelligence, and determination, he had earned his place in the French military. His instructors noted that he had an exceptional talent for military engineering. The boy who had been mocked for his accent would one day command armies across Europe. The young man who felt like an outsider would become the most powerful ruler on the continent. But those dreams were still far away. For now, he was simply a young officer ready to begin his career in the service of King Louis XVI of France. They wrote in their reports that young Bonaparte would go far if circumstances favored him. Napoleon had learned to turn adversity into strength and to never accept defeat. He had discovered his genius for military matters and his ability to lead others. Most importantly, he had developed an unshakable belief in himself and his destiny. The lion had been born, and soon the world would hear his roar. He read every book he could find about great generals like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Frederick the Great. Other students began to follow him and ask for his advice. He passed with excellent marks, especially in mathematics and military subjects. His teachers recommended him for the most prestigious military school in France, the École Militaire in Paris. This was an incredible honor for a boy from Corsica. Only the very best students were chosen to study there. During winter, when snow covered the school grounds, Napoleon organized elaborate snowball fights. He divided the boys into armies and planned complex battles. Even these games showed his genius for warfare. His side almost always won because he could think faster and plan better than anyone else. He studied their battles and tried to understand how they won their victories. His teachers saw that he had a brilliant mind for military strategy. They said he could see the whole battlefield in his head and plan moves like a chess master. Everything was different in France. The buildings were bigger, the people dressed differently, and everyone spoke French all the time. Napoleon felt like a stranger in a strange land. The other students made fun of his accent and called him names because he came from Corsica. They laughed at his Italian surname and said he was not a real Frenchman. The capital city of France amazed him with its grand palaces, wide streets, and thousands of people. But he was not there to sightsee. He had come to learn how to be an officer in the French army. This was a great opportunity, but it meant leaving his family and his island home. In January 1779, Napoleon and his older brother Joseph sailed away from Corsica. The Royal Military School of Brienne was where the sons of nobles learned to become officers in the French army. Napoleon was only 10 years old when he arrived at Brienne in May 1779. He would spend the next 5 years of his life there. The young boy stood on the deck of the ship and watched his homeland disappear over the horizon. He would not see it again for many years. But everything changed just 1 year before Napoleon was born. He had fought alongside the famous Corsican leader, Pasquale Paoli, against the French invasion. But when Paoli was defeated and fled to England, Charles made a difficult choice. His mother, Letizia, was a stern woman who believed in discipline. The food was simple, and the rooms were cold in winter. Napoleon did not mind the harsh conditions. What bothered him was that he was still an outsider. Most of the other boys came from wealthy French families. They had fine clothes and received money from home. Napoleon had very little money, and his clothes were plain. Charles worked hard to gain favor with the French governor of Corsica. He learned to speak perfect French and sent his children to French schools. He understood that education was the key to success in this new world. Napoleon was clearly the smartest of his 8 brothers and sisters. His teachers noticed that he could solve difficult problems and remember everything he read. She taught all her children that they must be strong and never show weakness. Napoleon learned this lesson well. Even as a small boy, he rarely cried and never backed down from a fight. He decided to work with the new French rulers instead of continuing the fight. Many Corsicans called him a traitor. Charles knew that if his family wanted to survive and prosper, they needed to become French. France had bought Corsica from Genoa in 1768. Now this rugged island with its proud people belonged to the French crown. Napoleon's father, Charles Bonaparte, was a lawyer and a minor nobleman. The Bonaparte family lived in a world caught between two cultures. Napoleon was a strange child from the very beginning. While other boys played games, he studied maps and read books about great military leaders. The Bonaparte family was not wealthy, but they were not poor either. When Napoleon was 9 years old, his life changed forever. The ship took them to the French port of Marseille. These cruel words made Napoleon angry, but they also made him determined. After a few months at Autun, Napoleon was selected to attend an even more important school. Brienne was a hard place for a young boy. The students lived like soldiers, waking up early and following strict rules. They wore uniforms and marched in formation. The other students continued to tease him about being from Corsica. At Brienne, Napoleon discovered his love for military history and mathematics. Napoleon also showed that he was a natural leader. In 1784, Napoleon took the final examinations at Brienne. Napoleon arrived in Paris in October 1784. He was 15 years old and had been away from home for 5 years. At the École Militaire, Napoleon studied artillery, which meant learning about cannons and how to use them in battle. Napoleon graduated from the École Militaire in September 1785. He was just 16 years old, but he was now Second Lieutenant Napoleon Bonaparte of the French Royal Artillery. As he put on his new uniform and looked at himself in the mirror, Napoleon could not have imagined what the future held. The seeds of greatness had been planted during these early years. Second Lieutenant Napoleon Bonaparte left the military school in Paris with high hopes. But the real world quickly taught him that life as a young officer would not be easy. He was assigned to an artillery regiment in the town of Valence, in southeastern France. At 16 years old, he was one of the youngest officers in the French army, and many older soldiers did not take him seriously. Napoleon's first years as an officer were frustrating. France was at peace, which meant there were no wars to fight and no chances for promotion. He spent his days drilling soldiers and maintaining cannons. The work was boring for someone with his brilliant mind. To make matters worse, his pay was very small. He still felt torn between his French career and his love for his homeland. He even joined a local political group that wanted more freedom for Corsica. For a while, Napoleon thought about leaving the French army to become a Corsican patriot like his hero Pasquale Paoli. But events in France would soon change everything. He read everything he could find about military history, politics, and philosophy. Unlike many of his fellow officers who feared the revolution, he saw it as an opportunity. The old system had kept men like him from rising to the top, because they were not born into noble families. The revolution promised that talent and merit would matter more than birth and family connections. This was exactly what Napoleon had been waiting for. He studied the campaigns of great generals and tried to understand what made them successful. The common people of France had grown tired of being ruled by kings and nobles, while they suffered from hunger and poverty. Napoleon realized that brave and capable men could now advance quickly if they proved themselves. He just needed to find the right moment to show what he could do. The port city of Toulon had rebelled against the revolutionary government and invited British and Spanish forces to help them. The revolutionary army surrounded the city but could not break through its defenses. The situation seemed hopeless until Napoleon arrived with a plan. In 1794, the radical leader, Robespierre, controlled France with an iron fist. Anyone suspected of opposing the revolution could be arrested and executed. In 1795, he saved the revolutionary government, again when rebels tried to overthrow it in Paris. Napoleon used cannons to scatter the mob in the streets. Josephine de Beauharnais was a beautiful widow, 6 years older than him. She had been married to a nobleman who was executed during the revolution. Napoleon fell deeply in love with her elegant manners and sophisticated charm. Despite warnings from his family that she was too old and had a questionable reputation, he married her in March 1796. This action earned him even more recognition, and the nickname General Vandermeer, after the revolutionary calendar name for the month when it happened. Napoleon was briefly imprisoned because some of his friends had connections to Robespierre's enemies. The government put him in command of the Army of Italy with orders to drive the Austrian forces out of northern Italy. This army was in terrible condition when Napoleon took command. He sent wagonloads of gold and artistic treasures back to France. The French people, who had suffered through years of war and economic hardship, celebrated him as their savior. In 1798, he convinced the French government to let him lead an expedition to Egypt. His plan was to conquer Egypt and then march to India to destroy British power in the east. At age, he was already one of the most powerful men in France. The soldiers had not been paid in months. Their uniforms were falling apart, and their morale was extremely low. For a few terrifying weeks, he faced the possibility of losing his head to the guillotine. Fortunately, Political changes in Paris led to his release. Napoleon's army's elite defeated the forces of the Egyptian rulers at the Battle of the Pyramids in July 1798. Napoleon told his soldiers before the battle that 40 centuries of history looked down upon you, inspiring them to fight with extraordinary courage. His Egyptian expedition had been a military failure, but his propaganda had convinced the French people that it was a great success. Napoleon had learned valuable lessons about the power of publicity and the importance of controlling information. He could continue serving as a general under the weak revolutionary government, or he could take power himself and reshape France according to his own vision. The choice he made would determine not only his own fate, but the destiny of all Europe. The thunder before the storm was growing louder, and soon the lightning would strike. These lessons would serve him well in the dramatic events that were about to unfold. The British Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, trapping Napoleon's army in Egypt. Disease killed more French soldiers than enemy bullets did. The Turks and their allies launched counterattacks that the French could barely repel. He secretly left his army in Egypt and sailed back to France. He abandoned thousands of soldiers who had followed him faithfully, but he understood that his political future depended on returning to France while he was still popular. After more than a year of fighting in the desert, Napoleon realized that his Egyptian dream was becoming a nightmare. The French occupied Cairo and Napoleon began to reorganize Egyptian society according to French revolutionary principles. They wanted freedom, equality, and the right to govern themselves. He promised the soldiers that if they followed him, he would lead them to glory and riches in the wealthy cities of Italy. More importantly, he proved that he could deliver on his promises. He defeated the Austrians at the battles of Lodi, Arco and Rivoli, using tactics that amazed military experts. He moved his troops faster than anyone thought possible and attacked his enemies where they least expected it. The people were losing faith in the revolution that had promised them so much. Napoleon saw that France needed strong leadership, and he believed that he was the man to provide it. His soldiers adored him because he shared their dangers and always seemed to know exactly what to do. In his first campaign, he won battle after battle against larger enemy forces. He convinced the commanders to let him position the cannons in a new way. Instead of attacking the city walls directly, he aimed his guns at the harbor where the enemy ships were anchored. The revolutionary government promoted him to brigadier general, making him one of the youngest generals in French history. People began calling him the Little Corporal because he was short and often worked alongside his soldiers instead of staying safely behind the lines. This forced the British and Spanish fleets to withdraw, leaving the rebels in Toulon without support. On July 14, 1789, angry crowds stormed the Bastille prison in Paris. This marked the beginning of the most dramatic period in French history. He filled notebook after notebook with his thoughts and plans. Other officers spent their free time drinking and gambling, but Napoleon spent his time learning. He could barely afford decent food and clothing. Sometimes he had to choose between buying books or buying dinner. During these quiet years, Napoleon did something that would prove more valuable than any battle experience. The young officer also returned to Corsica several times during these years. In 1789, the French Revolution began. Napoleon watched these events with great interest. The revolution created chaos in the French army. Many noble officers fled the country or were arrested. This left many important positions empty. That moment came in 1793 during the siege of Toulon. Napoleon was only 24 years old and still a low-ranking officer, but he had studied artillery warfare more than anyone else in the army. The plan worked perfectly. Toulon surrendered, and Napoleon became a hero overnight. Napoleon's success at Toulon almost ended in disaster the following year. After this close call, Napoleon focused entirely on his military career. Around this time, Napoleon met the woman who would become his first wife. Just days after his wedding, Napoleon received the assignment that would make him famous across Europe. Napoleon transformed this ragged force into a victorious army through the power of his personality and strategic genius. The Italian campaigns of 1796 and 1797 established Napoleon as the greatest general of his time. Napoleon's victories in Italy brought him enormous wealth and fame. But Napoleon was not satisfied with his success in Italy. He wanted to achieve something even more spectacular that would make him as famous as Alexander the Great. The Egyptian campaign began with great success. However, the Egyptian adventure soon turned into a disaster. In 1799, Napoleon made a decision that his enemies called cowardly, but that he knew was necessary. When Napoleon arrived in France in October 1799, he found the country in crisis once again. The government was weak and divided. French armies were losing battles across Europe. The young general who had left France as a promising officer returned as one of the most famous men in the world. As 1799 ended, Napoleon stood at a crossroads. Napoleon Bonaparte stepped off the ship at the French port of Fréjus on October 9, 1799, and immediately sensed that his moment had arrived. The crowds that gathered to welcome him back from Egypt cheered his name, as if he were already their ruler. France was crumbling under weak leadership, and the people desperately wanted someone strong to save their country. Napoleon knew he was that man. He met secretly with important politicians, generals, and businessmen who were unhappy with the current government. Many of these men believed that France needed a military dictator to restore order. They planned to use legal methods to change the government, but they needed Napoleon's fame and military reputation to make their plan work. Napoleon agreed to join them, but he had no intention of being anyone's puppet. They saw Napoleon as the perfect candidate, because he was popular with both the army and the common people. He surrounded the palace with loyal soldiers and prepared to intimidate the legislators into doing what he wanted. The plan was for the politicians to vote to dissolve the Directory and create a new government with Napoleon as one of 3 temporary leaders called consuls. When he entered the Council of 500 to address the legislators, many of them began shouting down with the dictator and outlaw him. Some deputies even tried to physically attack Napoleon, and he had to be rescued by his soldiers. He convinced the soldiers outside that the legislators had been bribed by foreign enemies and were about to vote to surrender France to Austria and Britain. The soldiers, who loved Napoleon and trusted his family, marched into the palace with fixed bayonets. Faced with armed force, most of the deputies fled. Those who remained voted to approve the new government. For a moment, it looked like the coup might fail completely. The Directory, which had governed France since 1795, was falling apart. The 5 men who ruled the country could not agree on anything important. French armies were losing battles in Italy and Germany. This bold move surprised the Austrians, who thought the mountains were impassable for a large army. Napoleon's soldiers dragged their cannons over icy peaks and through narrow valleys in one of the most daring military operations in history. By afternoon, Napoleon's army was retreating, and many observers thought the battle was lost. Napoleon himself was considering whether to order a full retreat when his General Desaix arrived with fresh troops. The economy was in ruins, and bandits roamed the countryside. Many French people began to wonder if the revolution had been a terrible mistake. He shared power with 2 other consuls, but everyone understood that he was really in charge. The weak Directory was finished, and France now had the strong leadership it desperately needed. Within hours, the French had turned defeat into victory. General Desaix was killed in the fighting, but his sacrifice saved Napoleon's reputation and secured French control of northern Italy. He signed an agreement called the Concordat in 1801 that allowed Catholics to practice their religion freely while keeping the government in control of church affairs. This compromise satisfied most French people who had missed their traditional faith but did not want to return to the days when priests had political power. Napoleon later said that Marengo was the battle he was most proud of winning. In 1802, he convinced the French people to make him consul for life, with the power to choose his successor. This was another step away from the democratic ideals of the Revolution, but most French citizens were willing to trade some freedom for the peace and prosperity that Napoleon provided. Napoleon had seized power through a combination of legal trickery, military force, and popular support. He created a system for training skilled government officials and promoted talented people regardless of their social background. He encouraged trade and industry, which brought prosperity back to French cities. Crime decreased as Napoleon's efficient police force restored order throughout the country. But Napoleon shocked everyone by taking the crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head. This dramatic gesture showed that he owed his power to no one but himself and God. He then crowned his wife Josephine as empress. His eyes were already turning toward the rest of Europe, where ancient monarchies trembled at the thought of what this revolutionary emperor might do next. The sword had seized the crown, and now it was time to see how far that sword could reach across the continent. The greatest adventures and the greatest dangers still lay ahead for the man who had made himself master of France. He used his success to negotiate favorable peace treaties with Austria and other enemies. Even today, the laws of France, Italy, Germany, and many other nations are based on principles that Napoleon established more than 2 centuries ago. This may be his most lasting contribution to human civilization. He looked at the kings and emperors who ruled other European countries and decided that he deserved equal dignity. In 1804, he took the final step in his rise to absolute power by declaring himself Emperor of the French. The French people approved this decision in a special vote, showing that they trusted him to rule wisely. By 1802, even Britain had agreed to make peace with France. Just 5 years earlier, he had been a general without an army, stranded in Egypt. Now he was the most powerful ruler in Europe, commanding the loyalty of 30 million French citizens. The boy from Corsica had conquered France itself. His greatest achievement was the creation of a new legal system called the Napoleonic Code. This collection of laws combined the best ideas from the Revolution with practical rules for everyday life. The code guaranteed equality before the law, protected private property, and ensured that government jobs would go to the most qualified candidates rather than to people with noble birth. For the first time in 10 years, France was not at war with anyone. They convinced the Directory that a dangerous plot against the government had been discovered. Using this fake emergency as an excuse, They moved both houses of the French legislature out of Paris to a palace called St. This would make it easier to control what happened next. They missed the order and stability they had known under the old kings. He understood that the French people were tired of revolution and war. They wanted peace, prosperity, and stable government. Napoleon promised to give them all three, while preserving the best achievements of the revolution, especially equality before the law and careers open to talent. Napoleon spent his first weeks back in France carefully studying the political situation. Austria and Britain had formed a new coalition with other European powers to destroy the French Republic. Austrian armies had recaptured much of northern Italy, while Napoleon was in Egypt. The situation looked desperate, but Napoleon had faced worse odds before. The conspiracy to overthrow the Directory was organized by a clever politician named Emmanuel Sieyès and Napoleon Esperdé, who was president of the Council of 500. On November 9, 1799, which the revolutionary calendar called 18 Brumaire, the conspirators put their plan into action. Napoleon was given command of all military forces in the Paris area. However, things did not go as smoothly as Napoleon had hoped. Napoleon's brother, Lucien, saved the day with quick thinking and bold action. By the end of that dramatic day, Napoleon Bonaparte had become first consul of France. The new first consul immediately set to work rebuilding France. One of Napoleon's first challenges was to defeat the enemies who were attacking France from all sides. In the spring of 1800, Napoleon personally led an army across the dangerous Alpine passes into Italy. The campaign nearly ended in disaster. At the Battle of Marengo, on June 14, 1800, the Austrians attacked early in the morning and seemed to be winning. Desaix launched a desperate counterattack. Just as the Austrians thought they had won, the surprise assault caught the enemy completely off guard. The victory at Marengo restored Napoleon's military reputation and strengthened his political position in France. Napoleon used this period of peace to transform French society. The Napoleonic Code was so well written that many countries around the world later adopted similar legal systems. Napoleon also made peace with the Catholic Church, which had been banned during the most radical phase of the Revolution. The first consul rebuilt France's schools, roads, and government departments. As Napoleon's successes mounted, his ambitions grew larger. However, being consul for life was not enough for Napoleon. The coronation ceremony took place at Cathedral in Paris on December 2, 1804. Pope Pius VII came from Rome to bless the new emperor. As Emperor Napoleon, the first looked out over the assembled nobles, diplomats, and officials at his coronation. He must have marveled at how far he had come. But Napoleon was not content to rule just France. Emperor Napoleon, I stood on the balcony of his palace at the Tuileries and gazed out over Paris. The city sparkled in the morning sun, and the tricolor flag of France flew proudly from every important building. But Napoleon's mind was not on his beautiful capital. He was thinking about the enemies who surrounded France and the battles he would have to fight to secure his empire. He spent months creating what would become known as the Grande Armée, the greatest military force the world had ever seen. He gathered over 200,000 of the best soldiers in Europe and trained them to fight as one magnificent machine. The crowning of Napoleon as emperor had terrified the kings and queens of Europe. He assembled a huge fleet of boats along the French coast and trained his soldiers for an amphibious assault across the English Channel. For months, the British people lived in terror that the French emperor would appear on their shores with his unstoppable army. The British Royal Navy was the strongest in the world, led by brilliant admirals like Horatio Nelson. On October 21, 1805, Nelson destroyed the combined French and Spanish fleets at the Battle of Trafalgar. This crushing naval defeat ended any hope Napoleon had of invading Britain directly. They saw him as a dangerous upstart who threatened the natural order of the world. How could they accept as an equal a man who had crowned himself emperor through his own merit, rather than inheriting his throne from God and his ancestors? Austria and Russia had formed the third coalition against France and were marching their armies toward French territory. Britain provided money and weapons to support these continental enemies. Napoleon realized he would have to abandon his invasion plans and turn his attention to the east. The old monarchies of Austria, Russia, and Britain began planning a new war to destroy this revolutionary emperor. Before his ideas spread to their own people, he marched his Grande Armée from the English Channel to the heart of Europe in just 6 weeks. This incredible march covered over 500 miles and caught the Austrian army completely by surprise. He surrounded an entire Austrian army of 50,000 men without fighting a single major battle. He pretended to be weak and afraid, even abandoning the high ground near Austerlitz to make the Allies think he was retreating. The Austrian and Russian emperors fell into his trap completely. Through brilliant maneuvering and perfect timing, he cut off all their escape routes and forced them to surrender. The Austrian general Mack had no choice but to hand over his sword and his army to the French emperor. The morning was cold and foggy, but as the sun rose and burned away the mist, it seemed to shine directly on the French emperor. His soldiers called it the Son of Austerlitz, and took it as a sign that heaven favored their cause. The Austrians expected months of preparation time, but suddenly Napoleon appeared in their rear areas like a thunderbolt. The Austrian Emperor Francis fled his own city, rather than face capture by the French. He had defeated two emperors with armies larger than his own through pure tactical genius. The victory proved that Napoleon was the greatest general since Alexander the Great and Caesar. The Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for over 800 years, was dissolved forever. Napoleon created a new organization called the Confederation of the Rhine, placing German princes under French protection. The British government fell when news of Austerlitz reached London, and even the strong-willed Prime Minister William Pitt died soon after, reportedly saying, "Roll up that map of Europe. It will not be needed these 10 years." Some Russian units tried to escape across a frozen pond, but Napoleon's cannons broke the ice and hundreds of men drowned in the freezing water. But this was exactly what Napoleon wanted them to do. As soon as the enemy forces moved away from the center of their line, Napoleon launched a massive attack that split the Allied army in two. He made his brother Joseph king of Naples and his brother Louis king of Holland. He had defeated every enemy who dared to face him on the battlefield. His armies seemed invincible, and his genius appeared limitless. But the emperor who had risen so high would soon discover that the higher one climbs, the farther there is to fall. The eagle was soaring at its greatest height, but storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. He created new duchies and principalities for his most loyal generals and supporters. The emperor was building a new European order with France at its center and the Bonaparte family as its ruling dynasty. Napoleon entered Vienna in triumph on November 13, 1805, and established his headquarters in the magnificent Schönbrunn Palace. But he knew that his greatest test still lay ahead. Soult's men charged up the Pratzen Heights and captured the key position that controlled the entire battlefield. Prussia, seeing the destruction of Austria, began to prepare for war against France. Britain continued to fight at sea and to finance anyone willing to oppose the French emperor. Most dangerous of all, Napoleon's own ambitions were growing beyond what any man could reasonably achieve. From this commanding height, French cannons poured deadly fire into the confused ranks of Austrians and Russians below. His empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of Poland. Kings and princes who had once looked down on him as an upstart now begged for his friendship and protection. The eagle had indeed spread its wings, and its shadow fell across the entire continent. He created an efficient system for feeding and supplying his troops that allowed them to move faster and fight longer than any enemy force. Most importantly, he filled his soldiers with complete confidence in their emperor and their cause. These men would follow Napoleon anywhere because they believed he could never be defeated. This proved that the emperor was not just a lucky general, but a military genius who could outthink and outmaneuver any opponent. The news of made Napoleon's remaining enemies even more determined to destroy him. Before he became unstoppable, Napoleon knew that war was coming, and he prepared for it with the same energy and intelligence that had brought him to power. The emperor personally designed new uniforms, weapons, and battle tactics for his army. Napoleon's original plan was to invade Britain and end the war quickly by capturing London. However, Napoleon's invasion plans depended on his navy gaining control of the seas, and this proved impossible. The news of Trafalgar reached Napoleon, just as he was facing a new threat on land. The emperor moved with lightning speed to meet this new challenge. At the town of Ulm, in southern Germany, Napoleon achieved one of his greatest strategic victories. The victory at Ulm sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Napoleon had destroyed a major enemy army without losing more than a few hundred of his own men. After Ulm, Napoleon marched his army toward Vienna, the capital of the Austrian Empire. The Russian Emperor Alexander Idris had brought a large army to help the Austrians, and together they outnumbered Napoleon's forces. The two emperors planned to attack the French near the small town of Austerlitz, in what is now the Czech Republic. They were confident that their superior numbers would crush Napoleon and end his threat to Europe forever. Napoleon welcomed this battle because he had chosen the ground carefully and had a perfect plan to defeat his enemies. On December 2, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation, Napoleon fought the Battle of Austerlitz. The battle unfolded exactly as Napoleon had planned. The Allies attacked his weak right wing, thinking they could easily break through. The French assault was led by Marshal Soult, one of Napoleon's most trusted generals. The Allied army collapsed in complete disorder. Soldiers threw away their weapons and ran for their lives. The Battle of Austerlitz was Napoleon's greatest victory and one of the most perfect battles in military history. The consequences of Austerlitz were enormous. Austria immediately asked for peace and signed a treaty that gave Napoleon control of much of Germany and Italy. Russia also withdrew from the war, leaving Britain alone to continue the fight against Napoleon. Napoleon used his victory to reshape the map of Europe according to his own vision. By 1806, Napoleon controlled directly or indirectly most of continental Europe west of Russia, but Napoleon's success also created new enemies and new challenges. As 1807 began, Napoleon stood at the peak of his power and glory. The summer sun blazed down on the Niemen River in Eastern Europe, as two of the most powerful men in the world prepared to meet. On June 25, 1807, Emperor Napoleon of France and Tsar Alexander I of Russia came together on a magnificent raft in the middle of the river. This meeting would change the fate of Europe and mark the highest point of Napoleon's incredible power. The two emperors had been bitter enemies just months before. Russian armies had fought against Napoleon at Austria. He had made peace with Russia, his most dangerous continental enemy, and gained a powerful ally in his struggle against Britain. The entire continent seemed to be under his control. Kings and princes across Europe competed for his attention and approval, like courtiers seeking favor from their master. Napoleon ruled over 70 million people directly, and his influence extended over millions more in allied independent states. His brothers and sisters wore crowns in Naples, Holland, Spain, and Westphalia. This was an economic war designed to destroy British trade and force Britain to make peace. Every port from Hamburg to Naples was closed to British ships. Any merchant caught trading with Britain faced severe punishment. Napoleon believed that if he could cut off Britain's trade with Europe, the island nation would collapse from economic ruin. His stepson ruled Italy, and his marshals governed duchies carved from conquered territories. He made his most successful generals into dukes and princes, giving them vast estates and incomes to support their new dignity. These men owed everything to Napoleon and formed a loyal foundation for his power. Unlike the old aristocrats who inherited their positions, Napoleon's nobles had earned their rank through service and talent. European merchants and consumers suffered when they could no longer buy popular British goods, like textiles and manufactured items. The emperor loved ceremony and splendor, surrounding himself with elaborate rituals that rivaled those of the old monarchy. He created a new imperial nobility, complete with fancy titles, colorful uniforms, and strict rules of etiquette. The Spanish people had risen in revolt against his brother Joseph, whom Napoleon had installed as their king in 1808. British forces under the Duke of Wellington landed in Portugal to support the Spanish resistance. What Napoleon expected to be a quick campaign to secure his control became a bloody guerrilla war that would drain French resources for years. This helped legitimize his rule by making it seem as dignified and permanent as the ancient dynasties he had replaced. Coffee, sugar, and other colonial products became extremely expensive because British ships had controlled much of the world's trade. He extended the Napoleonic Code to conquer territories, giving people legal equality and protection of their property rights. He built new roads, schools, and hospitals. Pope Pius VII had excommunicated Napoleon for taking over the Papal States, creating tension with devout Catholics throughout Europe. He genuinely cared for his wife despite her faults and her inability to have children. But Napoleon always put duty before personal feelings. In December 1809, he tearfully told Josephine that their marriage must end for the good of France. He needed to marry someone from a royal family to legitimize his dynasty and create a powerful alliance. After considering several possibilities, he chose Marie-Louise, the 18-year-old daughter of Emperor Francis I of Austria. This marriage would unite the Bonaparte and Habsburg dynasties, two of the most powerful families in European history. She accepted the divorce with dignity, and they remained friends for the rest of their lives. The young Austrian princess was beautiful, intelligent, and well, the Spanish War continued to drain French resources and manpower. The continental system was creating resentment among merchants and consumers across Europe. He had risen from obscurity to become master of Europe through willpower, intelligence, and incredible good fortune. Why should that luck not continue forever? But history teaches that even the mightiest empires eventually face challenges that test their limits. For Napoleon, those challenges were approaching faster than he realized. Most ominously, Tsar Alexander was beginning to have second thoughts about his alliance with France. The Russian economy was suffering from the trade war with Britain, and many Russian nobles were urging their emperor to break free from French domination. More importantly, for Napoleon's plans, she came from a family famous for producing many children. The emperor was confident that she would give him the male heir he needed to establish his dynasty permanently. The constant warfare was exhausting France's young men, as Napoleon needed more and more soldiers to control his vast territories. He promoted religious tolerance and gave equal opportunities to people regardless of their birth or religion. He controlled most of Europe either directly or through alliances. His empire was larger than anything seen since the days of ancient Rome. Kings and emperors sought his friendship, and his armies had never been defeated in a major campaign. He had a new young wife who would hopefully give him sons to inherit his throne. Many Europeans genuinely benefited from French rule, even if they resented foreign domination. Spanish peasants and priests organized resistance groups that attacked French supply lines and disappeared into the mountains. For every guerrilla fighter the French killed, two more seemed to take his place. This was a new kind of warfare that even Napoleon's military genius struggled to overcome. He had been married to Josephine for over 13 years, but she had not given him the heir he desperately needed to secure his dynasty. As Emperor Napoleon felt he must have a son to inherit his throne and continue the Bonaparte line. This meant he would have to divorce the woman he truly loved and marry someone who could bear him children. He could work 18 hours a day, dictating letters, reviewing military plans, and making important decisions with lightning speed. His mind grasped the smallest details of administration while never losing sight of grand strategy. Visitors to his court were amazed by his ability to discuss everything from military tactics to poetry, from engineering to philosophy. Many people began to resent French rule because it made their daily lives harder and more costly. But Napoleon's victories had convinced Alexander that it was better to be France's friend than its enemy. Napoleon would control everything west of the Niemen River, while Alexander would dominate the east. They agreed to work together against their common enemy, Britain, and to force all other European nations to join their alliance. Prussia was crushed and reduced to half its former size. Poland was recreated as a French puppet state called the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. The young Tsar was also fascinated by Napoleon's genius and charisma. When they met face to face, Alexander fell completely under the French emperor's spell. The Treaty of Tilsit that came from this meeting divided Europe between the two greatest powers. Napoleon left Tilsit believing he had achieved something that no conqueror in history had managed. The French Empire now stretched from the North Sea to the Mediterranean and from the Atlantic Ocean deep into Germany. To complete his domination of Europe, Napoleon created what he called the Continental System. The Continental System seemed like a brilliant idea, but it created enormous problems. Napoleon tried to make up for these hardships by bringing the benefits of French civilization to all parts of his empire. The emperor also worked to create a new European nobility, based on merit rather than birth. During these golden years, Napoleon seemed to possess superhuman energy and ability. Napoleon's court at the Tuileries Palace became the most magnificent in Europe. However, cracks were beginning to appear in Napoleon's seemingly perfect empire. The Spanish situation troubled Napoleon because it showed that people would fight desperately for their independence, even against his powerful armies. Meanwhile, other problems were developing across the empire. The continental system was hurting French merchants as much as British ones. Napoleon's personal life also reached a crisis during this period. The decision to divorce Josephine was one of the most painful of Napoleon's life. Napoleon's search for a new wife became a matter of international diplomacy. The wedding between Napoleon and Marie-Louise took place in April 1810 with enormous ceremony. As 1810 ended, Napoleon stood at the absolute peak of his power and glory. Yet beneath this magnificent surface, dangerous forces were stirring. Napoleon seemed unaware of these growing problems, or perhaps he simply believed that his genius could overcome any challenge. Napoleon stood before the map in his study at the Tuileries Palace, staring at the red pins that marked French victories across Europe. But one area of the map troubled him deeply. The Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and Portugal lay, was marked with black pins, showing French defeats and ongoing problems. What had started as a simple campaign to secure his brother Joseph's throne had become what Napoleon himself called the Spanish ulcer, a wound that would not heal. The emperor thought this would be easy because the Spanish army was poorly equipped and their government was corrupt. He expected the Spanish people to welcome French rule and the benefits of modern civilization that came with it. The trouble in Spain had begun in 1808 when Napoleon decided to remove the weak Spanish royal family and replace them with his brother. Joseph Napoleon could not have been more wrong. The Spanish people rose in a massive rebellion against the French occupation. The French responded with equal cruelty, executing Spanish civilians suspected of helping the guerrilla. Entire villages were burned to the ground. The war became a cycle of violence and revenge that poisoned the relationship between France and Spain for generations. Marshal Soult conquered southern Spain, only to lose it again when he moved his troops elsewhere. Marshal Ney, known as the bravest of the brave, found himself constantly harassed by invisible enemies. Even Napoleon's personal intervention in 1808 and 1809 could not bring lasting peace to the peninsula. Unlike other European countries that had accepted defeat after losing a few battles, Spain refused to surrender. Wellington was one of the few generals who understood how to fight the French. He avoided large battles where Napoleon's superior tactics might defeat him. He provided them with weapons and training, while using them to gather intelligence about French movements. This combination of regular British troops and irregular Spanish fighters created a military problem that even Napoleon's genius could not solve quickly. He had to keep over 300,000 soldiers in Spain just to control the major cities and roads. These were some of his best troops, veterans who had fought at Austria. Within weeks, he had rushed from Paris to Germany with a hastily assembled army. But this time, something was different. The emperor was now 40 years old, no longer the young general who had dazzled Europe with his energy. He still won most of his battles through superior strategy and tactics. At Eckmühl and Ratisbon, he outmaneuvered Austrian forces and forced them to retreat. But these victories came at a higher cost than in previous campaigns. 1809. This was one of the largest battles Napoleon had ever fought, with over 300,000 men engaged on both sides. The fighting was fierce and bloody, lasting 2 full days. Napoleon finally won by concentrating massive artillery fire against the Austrian center, but the victory felt hollow. French casualties were enormous, and the Austrians retreated in good order rather than collapsing completely. French losses were heavier, and Napoleon's movements were less precise than before. His marriage to Mary Louise of Austria in 1810 was part of this strategy. By allying with the Habsburg dynasty, he hoped to secure his eastern frontier and focus on other problems. The birth of his son, Napoleon II, in March 1811 seemed to guarantee the future of his dynasty. His body was growing heavy, and his reflexes were slower. More troubling, many of his best marshals and soldiers were still fighting in Spain. The continental system was hurting French merchants as much as British ones. Most dangerously, Tsar Alexander of Russia was growing tired of his alliance with France. He was convinced that Alexander would never dare to challenge French power directly. The emperor had defeated Austria so many times that he believed no continental power could stand against him. This confidence would soon be tested in the most dramatic way possible. Russian nobles were pressuring their emperor to resume trade with Britain, which would mean breaking the continental system. He had overcome every challenge so far through courage, intelligence, and determination. Why should Russia be any different from his previous enemies? But deep in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered warnings about the dangers of overconfidence and the terrible price of hubris. Soon, the emperor would discover whether that voice spoke the truth. Public opinion in France was starting to turn against the constant warfare. The Austrian gamble had cost him valuable soldiers and resources. Now the emperor was about to make the greatest gamble of his career by challenging the largest country in Europe. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of Napoleon's empire and change the course of world history. French mothers were tired of sending their sons to die in foreign lands. Merchants complained that trade wars were ruining their businesses. Even Napoleon's own officials began to question whether the empire was becoming too large to govern effectively. Every month they spent fighting guerrillas in Spanish mountains was a month they could not spend preparing for other campaigns. He started assembling the largest army in European history, drawing troops from every corner of his empire. German, Italian, Polish, and Dutch soldiers would march alongside French veterans toward the distant borders of Russia. He had used similar pressure tactics successfully against Austria and Prussia. But Russia was different from those countries. It was vast, mysterious, and unconquered by any foreign army since the time of the Mongols centuries before. Instead, he built strong defensive positions and forced the French to attack him on ground of his choosing. Austria had been watching French difficulties in the peninsula and decided this was their chance for revenge. The Austrian Emperor Francis still burned with shame over his defeats at Austria. Napoleon was forced to accept a compromise that left Austria weakened but not destroyed. The emperor was beginning to learn that even his military genius had limits when faced with determined enemies and overstretched resources. Austrian generals convinced him that Napoleon was weakened by the Spanish War and could be defeated if Austria struck quickly. Spanish peasants, priests, and nobles united in their hatred of foreign rule. Austrian armies invaded Bavaria, Napoleon's German ally, hoping to spark a general uprising against French rule. The Austrian plan was to defeat Napoleon before he could withdraw troops from Spain and bring his full power to bear against them. They developed a new kind of warfare that the French army had never faced before. This new warfare was called guerrilla fighting, which means little war in Spanish. Instead of meeting French armies in open battle, where they would surely lose, Spanish fighters hid in mountains and forests. They attacked French supply convoys, murdered isolated soldiers, and vanished before the French could respond. When French troops entered Spanish villages, they found only silent hostility and hidden danger. The guerrilla war was incredibly brutal. Spanish fighters showed no mercy to French soldiers. They captured, often torturing them to death. Napoleon sent some of his best generals to Spain, but none of them could solve the problem. The situation became worse when British forces landed in Portugal under the command of Sir Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington. Wellington also worked closely with Spanish and Portuguese guerrilla fighters. The Spanish War drained France of men and money that Napoleon desperately needed elsewhere. While Napoleon struggled with Spain, new threats emerged elsewhere in Europe. In April 1809, Austria launched what became known as the War of the Fifth Coalition. Napoleon reacted to the Austrian attack with his usual speed and energy. The German campaign of 1809 showed both Napoleon's continued brilliance and his growing limitations. The decisive battle came at Wagram on July 5 and 6. After Wagram, Austria once again asked for peace, but the terms were not as favorable to France as after previous wars. The Austrian War revealed another troubling development for Napoleon. Napoleon tried to address these concerns through diplomacy rather than conquest, but the fundamental problems of the empire remained unsolved. The Spanish War continued to drain French resources with no end in sight. Napoleon noticed signs of Russian dissatisfaction but chose to ignore them. As 1811 turned into 1812, Napoleon began planning what he thought would be a short campaign to bring Russia back into line. Napoleon was confident that this massive force would terrify Alexander into submission without a major battle. The Spanish ulcer had weakened Napoleon's empire and revealed the limits of French power. Standing before his maps and studying the roads that led to Moscow, Napoleon felt the familiar excitement of approaching battle. The morning of June 24th, dawned clear and warm along the banks of the Niemen River. Napoleon Bonaparte stood on a hill overlooking the water that separated his empire from Russia, watching as the largest army in human history prepared to cross into enemy territory. Behind him stretched a seemingly endless column of soldiers, horses, and wagons that extended 4 miles across the Polish countryside. Napoleon had assembled over 600,000 men for this campaign, drawing troops from every corner of his empire. Russia had been violating the continental system by secretly trading with Britain, and Napoleon could not allow this challenge to his authority. He expected to march to Moscow, dictate terms to Alexander, and return to Paris before winter. It seemed like a simple plan that would take only a few months to complete. French veterans marched alongside German allies, Italian conscripts, and Polish volunteers. There were Austrians who had been forced to join the campaign, Dutch soldiers far from their homeland, and even a few Swiss and Spanish units. Instead of fighting, they would trade space for time. Russia was enormous, with vast distances that could swallow even the largest army. In Germany and Austria, he had been able to capture enemy capitals within weeks and force his opponents to make peace. But Russia was so vast that capturing a few cities meant nothing. The country seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon like an ocean of forests and fields. By retreating deeper into their homeland, the Russians forced Napoleon to march farther and farther from his supply bases, while stretching his forces dangerously thin. This Grande was larger than the entire population of many European cities. Many men collapsed from exhaustion during the long marches. Horses died by the thousands, leaving artillery pieces and supply wagons stranded along the roadside. Worst of all, the Russian army continued to retreat, denying Napoleon the quick decisive battle he desperately needed. His advisors urged him to stop the campaign and establish winter quarters in the conquered territory. They pointed out that the army was already weakened by disease and hunger, and winter was approaching. He had staked his reputation on this campaign and could not return to Paris without achieving his goals. The emperor convinced himself that one more great battle would force Alexander to surrender. He ordered the army to continue eastward toward Moscow, the ancient capital of Russia and the heart of the Russian Empire. A sensible general would have listened to this advice and planned to resume the campaign the following spring. Instead, he found an empty city. The Russians had evacuated their capital, taking with them everything of value. The young Tsar had grown tired of being Napoleon's junior partner and was under pressure from Russian nobles who hated the alliance with France. Food and ammunition had to be carried hundreds of miles from French bases to reach the advancing army. Whether started deliberately by Russian agents or accidentally by French soldiers, the flames spread rapidly through the wooden buildings. For 3 days, Napoleon watched helplessly as most of Russia's ancient capital burned around him. The fires destroyed the supplies his army desperately needed and left his men camping in the ruins of a once great city. The Russian general Kutuzov had decided to make a stand to protect the holy city. Both armies prepared for what they knew would be one of the bloodiest battles in history. Russian cavalry and Cossacks harassed the French columns constantly, picking off stragglers and attacking supply trains. The weather turned bitterly cold earlier than usual, and many soldiers froze to death because they lacked proper winter clothing. Only the emperor's tactile genius and the sacrifice of thousands of soldiers allowed the remnants of the Grande to escape across the icy river. But even this success came at a terrible price in human life. Discipline collapsed as men fought each other for food and shelter. French artillery pounded Russian positions for hours, while Russian cannons responded with equally devastating fire. Leaving his remaining soldiers under the command of Marshal Murat, the emperor raced back to Paris in a sleigh to deal with political problems at home. Behind him, the greatest army ever assembled continued its death march toward Poland. The Grande had been destroyed not by enemy bullets, but by the vastness of Russia and the cruelty of winter. Napoleon's reputation for invincibility lay frozen in the Russian snow alongside the bodies of his soldiers. Infantry charges and countercharges swept back and forth across the battlefield like deadly waves. Napoleon's marshals led attack after attack against Russian redoubts, capturing them at enormous cost in human life. His enemies across Europe took courage from his defeat and began planning new coalitions against France. The myth of French invincibility was broken forever. The man who had conquered most of Europe had finally met an enemy he could not defeat. The endless expanse of Russia and the determination of a people fighting for their homeland. Over 250,000 men faced each other across fields that would soon be soaked with blood. Russian cavalry constantly attacked these supply convoys, destroying vital resources and killing the soldiers who guarded them. But the victory felt hollow, because it had cost Napoleon over 35,000 casualties, including many of his best officers and veterans. The Russian losses were even heavier, but they could afford them better because they were fighting for their homeland. More importantly, the Russian army had not been destroyed and could continue to resist. The Grande began to go hungry, even though they were supposedly winning the campaign. When French diplomats delivered Napoleon's ultimatum, Alexander refused to even respond. Instead, he began moving Russian armies eastward, away from the French border. The emperor was convinced that this massive show of force would bring Tsar Alexander to his knees without a major battle. This surprised the French emperor, who had expected Alexander to defend his frontier with everything he had. The Russians fought fiercely to defend this important city, but when defeat seemed certain, they set fire to their own buildings and retreated once again. Napoleon found himself master of a burning ruin instead of a valuable prize. Even worse, the Russian army had escaped to fight another day. Napoleon pressed forward, hoping to catch and destroy the Russian army before it could escape completely. But the Russians seemed to melt away like snow in spring, always staying just beyond his reach. But Alexander had no intention of submitting to French demands. As Napoleon's army crossed the Niemen River, Russian forces retreated without offering battle. The Russian strategy had been carefully planned by generals who understood that they could not defeat Napoleon in open battle. As the French army advanced through Lithuania and Belarus, Napoleon began to realize that this campaign would be different from all his previous wars. The weather also became an enemy. The summer of 1812 was unusually hot, and French soldiers suffered terribly from heat, thirst, and disease. Napoleon's supply system, which had worked perfectly in previous campaigns, began to break down under the strain of the enormous distances. The first major battle came at Smolensk in August, but it did not give Napoleon the victory he hoped for. After Smolensk, Napoleon faced the most difficult decision of his career. But Napoleon was not willing to accept anything less than total victory. The decisive battle finally came on September 7th, near the village of Borodino, just west of Moscow. The Battle of Borodino was a nightmare of violence and destruction. By evening, the French had technically won the battle. They controlled most of the battlefield and had forced the Russians to retreat. A week after Borodino, Napoleon entered Moscow in triumph, expecting to find Alexander's representatives waiting to negotiate surrender. On the night of September 14th, fires began breaking out across Moscow. Napoleon waited in Moscow for over a month, sending letter after letter to Alexander proposing peace negotiations. But the Tsar refused to respond to any French communications. Alexander had learned the lesson of previous wars. Napoleon could only be defeated by refusing to play by his rules. As long as Russia would not make peace, the French emperor was trapped in a country too large to conquer and too hostile to hold. By mid-October, Napoleon finally accepted that Alexander would never negotiate. While French troops remained on Russian soil, snow had already begun to fall, and winter was approaching fast. The emperor made the decision that doomed his army. He would retreat to Poland and try again the following year. On October 19th, Grande began its long march back toward the Niemen River. The retreat from Moscow became one of the greatest disasters in military history. At the Berezna River in late November, Napoleon's army faced complete destruction when Russian forces nearly surrounded them. By December, Napoleon realized that his army was finished as an effective fighting force. When the survivors finally crossed back into friendly territory, fewer than 40,000 effective soldiers remained from the 600,000 who had marched into Russia 6 months earlier. The Russian campaign marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. Napoleon arrived back in Paris on December 18, 1812. After a desperate journey across Europe in a simple sleigh, the man who had left France 6 months earlier as the master of a continent returned as the leader of a broken army. But even in this darkest hour, the emperor refused to admit defeat. Kings and generals who had trembled at the mention of Napoleon's name suddenly found new courage. The myth of French invincibility was shattered, and everyone could see that the great emperor was not unbeatable after all. Prussia, which had been forced to help Napoleon in Russia, quickly switched sides and joined a new alliance against France. He immediately began planning to rebuild his forces and strike back at his enemies. Russian forces crossed the frozen rivers of Poland, eager for revenge against the man who had burned Moscow. Prussian generals who remembered their humiliation at Jena sought to restore their nation's military honor. British gold funded this massive alliance, while British ships carried supplies to support the advancing armies. At age 43, with his empire crumbling around him, Napoleon rediscovered the tactical brilliance of his youth. The 1813 campaign in Germany would showcase some of his most impressive military performances. Even as he fought a losing battle against overwhelming odds, his young soldiers, many of them barely trained recruits, fought with desperate courage under their emperor's inspiring presence. These victories proved that Napoleon's genius had not dimmed even in defeat. The news of the Russian disaster spread across Europe like wildfire. Within weeks of Napoleon's return, a powerful coalition formed against him. Russia, Prussia, Britain, and Sweden united in what became known as the Sixth Coalition. He had spent 15 years building his empire, and the thought of giving it all away was unbearable. Napoleon believed that one more great victory would force his enemies to offer better terms. This decision to continue fighting would prove to be one of the greatest mistakes of his career. Napoleon's new army, though brave, lacked the cavalry and artillery needed to pursue defeated enemies and turn victories into decisive triumphs. but he was simply overwhelmed by the sheer number of his enemies. Russian, Prussian, Austrian, and Swedish forces attacked from every direction, while British officers coordinated the coalition strategy. Saxon troops who had been fighting for France suddenly turned their guns on their former comrades. This betrayal completed the disaster, and Napoleon was forced to retreat with the remnants of his army. Coalition cavalry pursued the broken French army across Germany, capturing thousands of prisoners and destroying vital supplies. Napoleon's empire in Central Europe collapsed like a house of cards as his allies deserted him one by one. By November, French forces had been pushed back across the Rhine River for the first time in 20 years. The emperor had suffered his first major defeat since the early days of his career. For the first time since the revolution began, foreign armies marched on French soil. The roles were completely reversed from the great days of Napoleon's conquests. Now it was French villages that burned and French civilians who fled from advancing enemy countries. Napoleon could win battles, but he could not win the war. Every day brought news of new disasters as coalition armies advanced deeper into France. Lyon fell, then Bordeaux, then other major cities. The French people, exhorted by 20 years of warfare, began to welcome the invaders as liberals. They offered him the chance to rule France within its traditional boundaries, keeping his throne but giving up all foreign conquests. Once again, Napoleon seemed to consider this offer, but his pride and ambition would not let him accept what he saw as humiliating surrender. Instead of pursuing Napoleon's army, the coalition leaders decided to march directly on Paris. They knew that capturing the French capital would end the war more quickly than defeating Napoleon in battle. He raced toward Paris with his loyal guards, hoping to retake the city in one final desperate assault. But his marshals and generals had finally had enough. Led by Marshal Ney, they refused to continue what they saw as a hopeless struggle. The man who had once ruled most of Europe was giving up his throne and accepting exile to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba. The great adventure that had begun with a young artillery officer's dreams of glory was ending in defeat and humiliation. Even Napoleon's closest supporters were telling him that the time had come to surrender. On March 31, 1814, Tsar Alexander and King Frederick, William of Prussia, entered Paris at the head of their victorious armies. The eagle was caged, but its spirit remained unbroken. On the island of Elba, the former emperor would have time to reflect on his meteoric rise and dramatic fall, but he would also have time to plan one last gamble that would shake Europe to its foundations and write the final, most dramatic chapter of his incredible story. Even Napoleon's tactical genius could not overcome such impossible odds. The coalition forces could afford to lose battles because they had unlimited reserves of men and supplies. Working day and night, he created a new army from raw recruits, veterans returning from Spain, and soldiers scraped together from garrison duties. These men lacked the experience and equipment of the old Grande, but they had something equally valuable. They were fighting for their homeland. These veteran soldiers had followed him through countless campaigns and remained loyal even in defeat. With tears in his eyes, the emperor kissed the eagle standard of the guard and told his men farewell. "I have sacrificed all my interests for those of the country," he said. "I go, but you, my friends, will continue to serve France." They were willing to let him keep his throne if he would give up his conquests in Germany, Italy, and Poland. For a brief moment, it seemed that Napoleon might accept this compromise and save what remained of his empire. They were soon joined by Austria, despite Napoleon's marriage to Emperor Francis's daughter. Even Napoleon's father-in-law had decided that family ties mattered less than destroying the French threat once and for all. Napoleon faced a coalition army of over 300,000 men, with only 200,000 of his own troops. For 3 days, the largest battle in European history raged across the plains of Saxony. With only 70,000 men, he fought a series of lightning battles against coalition forces that outnumbered him by more than 3 to 1. At Kempubert-Montmirail, defeating enemy detachments and keeping his tiny army alive against impossible odds. The coalition armies began advancing toward France from multiple directions. Napoleon faced the greatest crisis of his career, but he responded with the same energy and determination that had brought him to power. The emperor himself seemed transformed by the desperate situation. The first major battles came at Lutzen and Bautzen in May 1830. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, Napoleon defeated both Russian and Prussian forces through superior strategy and personal leadership. But these tactical successes could not hide the strategic reality that France was slowly being crushed by the weight of all Europe united against it. The coalition leaders offered Napoleon peace terms that would have left him ruling France within its natural borders. But the emperor could not bring himself to surrender the territories that had made him master of Europe. The decisive moment came in October 1813 at the Battle of Leipzig, which became known as the Battle of the Nations because soldiers from so many countries participated. Napoleon fought brilliantly at Leipzig, moving his forces with the skill of a master chess player. On the final day of battle, several of Napoleon's German allies switched sides in the middle of the fighting. The retreat from Leipzig became a race for survival. The coalition armies paused at the French border, hoping that Napoleon would finally accept reasonable peace terms. In January 1814, coalition forces crossed the Rhine and invaded France itself. Napoleon's response to this invasion was perhaps the most brilliant campaign of his entire career. These victories in the campaign of France were tactically perfect, but strategically meaningless. The end came with shocking suddenness. Napoleon was still fighting in the countryside when he learned that his capital had fallen. On April 6, 1814, at the palace of Fontainebleau, Napoleon Bonaparte signed his abdication as Emperor of the French. As Napoleon prepared to leave for exile, he addressed his old guard one final time. The first chapter of Napoleon's extraordinary life was ending, but the final act of his drama was yet to be written. The Mediterranean island of Elba sparkled in the morning sunshine as Napoleon Bonaparte stood on the balcony of his modest palace, gazing across the water toward the French coast. 10 months had passed since his abdication, and the former emperor of Europe now ruled over just 12,000 inhabitants on an island barely larger than Paris. But in his restless mind, Napoleon was already planning the most audacious comeback in history. The returned nobles demanded their old privileges back and treated veterans of Napoleon's wars with contempt. The economy struggled under the burden of war, reparations, and many French citizens began to remember the glory days of the empire with growing nostalgia. Secret letters reached Napoleon daily, begging him to return and save France from its incompetent rulers. Life on Elba had become unbearable for a man who once commanded millions. Napoleon tried to keep busy by improving roads, reorganizing the small army, and modernizing the island's government. The soldiers were ordered to arrest the former emperor and bring him back to Paris in chains. Instead of fighting, Napoleon walked boldly toward the enemy soldiers, opened his coat, and shouted, "If any of you wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." The regiment immediately threw down their weapons and joined his growing army with cries of "Long live the emperor." But these minor projects could not satisfy someone who had reshaped the map of Europe. Every day brought news from France that made his exile more painful to endure. Marshal Ney, who had sworn to King Louis that he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, fell to his knees and begged his old master's forgiveness when they met. Entire divisions of the royal army switched sides without firing a shot. King Louis XVIII had fled the country during the night, abandoning his throne and his supporters. The French people welcomed their returning emperor with wild celebrations, as if the disasters of 1814 had never happened. Napoleon was back in power through the sheer force of his personality and the loyalty of the French army. Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington, his old opponent from Spain, who commanded a mixed army of British, Dutch, and German troops. A few miles away, the Prussian army under Marshal Blucher was racing to join the battle and tip the balance against the French. His plan was to defeat Wellington quickly before the Prussians could arrive, then turn to deal with Blucher's forces. For most of the day, the plan seemed to be working. French attacks gradually wore down Wellington's defensive line, and by late afternoon, the British seemed ready to break. The Restoration government collapsed as quickly as it had been established. The Congress of Vienna, where the great powers were redrawing the map after his first defeat, immediately declared him an outlaw and enemy of mankind. Napoleon ordered his elite imperial guard to make one final desperate attack against Wellington's center. For a moment, it seemed this last gamble might succeed, but the guard, which had never been defeated in battle, was thrown back with heavy losses. But the French people, exhausted by decades of warfare, had no stomach for another long struggle. The politicians who had welcomed Napoleon's return now demanded his abdication. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon signed his second and final renunciation of the French throne. At 46, he was tired and sick, possibly suffering from stomach cancer. Hoping for generous treatment from his most honorable enemy, he surrendered himself to Captain Frederick Maitland of HMS. His quarters at Longwood House were cramped and uncomfortable. Worst of all, the British governor Sir Hudson Lowe treated him as a common prisoner rather than a fallen emperor, which wounded Napoleon's pride more than any physical discomfort. "I come to throw myself on the protection of your laws," Napoleon told the British officer, believing he would be allowed to live quietly in England as a private citizen. He suffered from stomach problems that may have been cancer, though some historians believe he was slowly poisoned by the lead paint in his rooms. He grew fat and pale, a shadow of the dynamic young general who had conquered Europe. But his mind remained sharp, and he continued planning reforms and writing until almost the end of his life. The legal codes he created still govern many nations today. His ideas about equality, merit-based, advancement, and efficient government spread across the globe. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets to welcome home their emperor's body. The man who had been born a subject of France died as its greatest son, remembered not for his defeats, but for his incredible achievements. A poor boy from a conquered island became the master of Europe through talent, determination, and an unshakable belief in his destiny. He proved that in the modern world, merit could triumph over birth. and that one extraordinary individual could change the course of human history. The wars he fought helped create the modern concepts of nationalism and popular sovereignty that would reshape the 19th century. They chose the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean as his final prison. This rocky outcrop was thousands of miles from any major land, surrounded by British naval patrols, and impossible to escape from. His legend inspired revolutionaries, poets, and dreamers for generations after his death. He showed the world what was possible when human ambition was unleashed, for both good and ill. The eagle had fallen, but its spirit would soar forever in the hearts of those who dared to dream of greatness. His last words were reported to be Francais' army, head of the army, Josephine, showing that even in death his thoughts remained with the country and people he had loved most. The British buried him on St. Helena with military honors, but without the imperial ceremony he deserved. Here the man who had once ruled Europe would spend his remaining years as a closely guarded prisoner. His reactions were slower, and he made several costly mistakes during the battle. Panic spread through the ranks as soldiers threw down their weapons and fled in disorder. Napoleon himself barely escaped capture as coalition cavalry pursued the broken remnants of his forces. But close was not enough for an emperor whose reputation depended on winning every battle. He carefully crafted the legend of his life, emphasizing his role as a defender of the French Revolution and a champion of equality and progress. These writings spread throughout Europe after his death and helped create the romantic myth that surrounded his memory. The legend of Napoleon's invincibility died forever on the fields of Belgium, along with thousands of French soldiers who had believed in their emperor's genius. The Battle of Waterloo was over, and with it, ended Napoleon's dreams of restored glory. Most crucially, he failed to prevent the Prussian army from joining the fight at the critical moment. Within days, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia formed a new coalition with the goal of destroying Napoleon once and for all. His only hope was to defeat the British and Prussian armies in Belgium before the Russians and Austrians could arrive. With typical boldness, he assembled an army of 120,000 men and marched north to begin what would be his final campaign. Over 700,000 Allied soldiers began marching toward France from every direction. Loading a small ship with his most loyal followers, he slipped past British naval patrols and sailed toward the French coast. When the ship landed near Cannes on March 1st, Napoleon had fewer than 1,000 men with him. Against the entire restored monarchy of France, this seemed like a hopeless gesture by a desperate exile. King Louis XVIII, who had been restored to the French throne, was deeply unpopular with the people. On the night of February 26, 1815, Napoleon made his decision. But Napoleon understood the power of his legend better than anyone else. As he marched north toward Paris, he sent messengers ahead with a brilliant proclamation: "The eagle will fly from steeple to steeple until it reaches the towers of Notre Dame." This simple phrase captured the imagination of the French people and spread like wildfire across the country. The first test came when Napoleon encountered a regiment of royal troops blocking his path near Grenoble. This scene repeated itself again and again as Napoleon marched toward Paris. On March 20th, exactly 100 days after leaving Elba, Napoleon entered Paris in triumph. But Napoleon's return terrified the rest of Europe. Napoleon knew he had to strike quickly before this massive coalition could unite against him. The decisive battle came on June 18, 1815, near the small Belgian village of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo began at noon, with Napoleon confident of victory. But Napoleon was no longer the swift, decisive general of his youth. When Blucher's forces appeared on Napoleon's right flank in the evening, the French army was caught between two enemies. The sight of the Imperial Guard retreating broke the spirit of the entire French army. Wellington later called Waterloo the nearest run thing you ever saw, admitting that Napoleon came very close to victory. After Waterloo, Napoleon fled back to Paris, hoping to organize resistance from the capital. Napoleon briefly considered escaping to America to start a new life, but British ships controlled all the ports. Instead, the British government decided that Napoleon was too dangerous to remain anywhere in Europe. Napoleon arrived at St. Helena in October 1815 and immediately began what he called the most wretched existence. During his 6 years of exile, Napoleon spent his time writing memoirs and letters that would shape how future generations remembered his extraordinary career. Napoleon's health declined steadily during his final years. On May 5, Napoleon's death did not end his influence on the world. In 18, the French government finally brought Napoleon's remains back to Paris and placed them in a magnificent tomb at Lesson. Napoleon Bonaparte's life story reads like a fantastic novel, but every word of it is true. Even in defeat and exile, Napoleon remained larger than life.